experienced, sharp, tactically advised diplomats. And they watch and see what you write, as if it was always some sort of provocation for their own position. So I decided to write this book after my tenure. Of course, I started it still when I was in Geneva. But there are a few ideas, and I'll come back to that in a minute, which are of my own, and which I believe I can now go public with, which was not the case when I was in charge. But I also, when I left the WTO, took a sort of commitment vis-à-vis the General Council, which is the governing body when ministers are not around, that I wouldn't publicly take issues on sensitive topics on trade, whether China will win the next dispute, or whether the leader of the majority in one of the two US houses is right or wrong about Trade Promotion Authority. And I've taken the commitment not to interfere with these issues publicly during 1 year. Why 1 year? 1 year is what we call in French le délai de veuvage in my native Normandy. When you become a widow, in my tradition of my place, you have to behave during 1 year. And what happens after this year is up to you. So I basically have to behave during 1 year. Now, to the purpose and a few messages of this book, which the title of which is Geneva Consensus, and which I published with the Cambridge University Press, as Anthony said, at the end of last year. My idea in starting this work was to try and make a public case. When I mean public, it's beyond the traditional trade bonds, whether in the WTO Secretariat, or in the OECD, or in the World Bank, or in the IMF, or in trade ministries, a public case for trade opening. And in order to do that, my idea was to relate trade and the benefits of trade to what really matters for people, which is not trade, but which is jobs, health, food, the environment, human rights, corruption, things which are issues people care about. And to try and remake the case that trade opening under some conditions, and I'll enter into that in a minute, is a good way to improve standards of living, hence relate to what really matter for the people, wherever they are located on this planet. So in a way, sort of subtitle, title is the Geneva Consensus, the subtitle is making trade work for all, and the subtitle could have been trade and, which is the way I structured the various chapters of the book. Now, 3, 4, or 5 main messages, and then we will go to the more interactive part of the session. The first one is that trade opening generally works, rather than the other way around, but it works best if embedded in adequate policies and institutions, most of which are of domestic nature, some of which have to do with international regulations liberalization of trade. And this is where I sort of coined this Geneva consensus formula, which I used for the first time when I was campaigning for being elected on the WTO in 2005. It's, of course, because WTO is headquartered in Geneva, as many other international organizations who are actors on the end of trade hand, but also, of course, with some, I would say, vague reference to the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus, although one could see that as a bit of a caricature on trade, is open, liberalize, and God, or the invisible hand, depending on your beliefs, will take care of the rest. Now, that's not, in my view, the right approach. The right approach is to consider how the benefits of trade opening accrue, and they accrue because of competitive shocks through a well-known Ricardian Schumpeterian model. If I do something better than you, and you do something better than I, then we both have an immediate interest to exchange. I will benefit from your efficiency as compared to mine, the other way around. That's the sort of basic Smith-Ricardo, and I don't enter onto whether comparative advantages are absolute or relative. So it works, it creates efficiency, it helps adding value and growing your economy, jobs. But this takes place because of competitive shocks, which Schumpeter described perfectly well in terms of destruction creation. So it's not painless. It's efficient because it is not painless. And it sometimes is painful because it is efficient. And this leads to a series of considerations. Of course, mostly with domestic policies, insofar as they can be more or less well geared to harnessing this process, and in terms of, and this is always mostly a domestic national issue, in terms of the redistributional impact of this process. And if we have to define this process very simply globally, look at what globalization has done. Globalization has formidably reduced absolute poverty, and it has also very significantly increased inequalities. So Smith and Ricardo are right, but Schumpeter is also right. So this leads to the whole set of, again, domestic policies that allow this process to work in a way that, at the end of the day, gets the political support of people. We all know that the political economy of trade is a bit specific for reasons which have always been there, and which is this old anthropological attitude, which is scapegoating what's different from your identity, whether they were called barbarians or foreigners. And this is deeply entrenched in human mentality, which means that in political terms, trade opening is often a difficult case to make. Now, part of the conditions under which the benefits of trade opening accrue, as I said, are domestic nature. It has to do with education, it has to do with the social safety net, it has to do with industrial or regional policies, it has to do with the quality of consultation between social partners, and the best evidence of that is that if you poll public opinion, what you get is a high propensity to believe in the benefits of trade opening, correlated to the quality of social systems, with one or two exceptions. The country I happen to know best being one of these exceptions, but for other reasons. So there is a whole lot of domestic conditions that need to be there. And again, looking at the trade performance or the support in public opinion for trade opening, the main variables that discriminate the differences, that explain the differences, are of a domestic nature. Now, there is also, of course, part of this process, the quality, the benefits, of which depend on international regulation, which is this notion that competition works best if competition is quote-unquote fair. Of course, once you've said that, you haven't defined what fair means. This is the usual discussion about fair trade, what some in my country have translated as juste échange, which is a fine concept, on one condition, which is that the partners to this exchange agree on what is fair. And agreeing on what is fair is a tough thing to do. It becomes the very purpose of international negotiations. The international regulation of trade, whether multilateral, bilateral, regional, and there are many avenues to do that, are all based on this notion that it works well if it is fair. And we all know that for a number of reasons, and especially stemming from the legacy of history, many of the parameters that govern international trade for a long time were not fair because they were the reflection of balances in forces which have very slowly changed with history. Colonialism being probably one of the best examples on how you can make trade unfair by the use of force and dominance. So that's a sort of general approach. A lot of attention must be on the conditions under which trade opening works. Second basic message, and I pumped a lot on my experience both as a EU Commissioner for Trade and as a WTO DG, is the huge changes which the last decades have brought to the way trade happens. In other words, the way the patterns of trade have evolved under one major transformational factor, which is technology, insofar as technology, whether the container, whether internet, or other devices still to come, shrinks the cost of distance to a speed and with proportions that never happened in history. We all know that the major waves of globalization, which translated into waves of increase of international exchange, started because of technological jumps, whether it's when you could cross the Atlantic with sailing boats, or whether these sails were replaced with steam, or whether you started to use electricity to transmit messages. It's roughly the same model, which is technological quantitative jump that leads to shrinking the cost of distance, that lead economic operators to localize differently their production systems, whether it's production of goods, whether it's the production of services, whether it's the production of ideas, if I may, has, as a result of these waves of technological change, hence increase in exchange, resulted in a different repartition of these production processes. And we have had in recent decades this example on which this house, by the way, worked a lot and has been in many ways the precursor, which is this structure of global supply chains, global value chains, where production of goods or services doesn't happen as it used to be in one place where you produce and then it's traded, imported or exported to another place where it is consumed. But this structure, which is now the dominant structure of international trade, where production processes are multi-localized, and are multi-localized in a way which is more and more flexible, if not volatile. Now, this is in many ways great news, notably for developing countries and for small businesses, for whom the previous entry ticket into the global market, where they can reap the benefits of economies of scale, used to be high. If you had to have a sort of full steel industry or car industry or chemical industry to reach out to the global market, the cost of entry is very high. If you only have to penetrate one segment of this production chain, then the entry ticket is much lower, and this gives a much more vibrant game of comparative advantages. So in many ways this is good news, again, because more and more participants can benefit from the players in this efficiency game. Of course, there is another side to that, which is that it's more flexible for you, it's easier for you, but it's also easier for others, including for your competitors. So in many ways, it makes this multi-localization much more spread, but much more volatile. Now, this leads to a number of important consequences. I don't insist on the statistical part of that, where I think at the time both the WTO and the OECD succeeded in a very important breakthrough, which was this endeavor, and I see Ken here, and I thank him again for the sort of engagement he showed in this sort of crusade, which was this idea that given this multi-localization of production processes, we should not measure trade the way we did it when something was produced in a country and consumed in another country. And of course, as we succeeded in producing in what I thought at the time was an incredibly short time, it only took 2 or 3 years to get there, which I think is an incredible performance, which, by the way, Internet explains, and the sort of network among statisticians it creates explains in large part. That reveals the real picture of not only how trade takes place, but where, in which country, in which part of this production chain you add value. In other words, how much of your economy you can grow through a better participation to international trade. And I just quote one number, which we've all been playing with in recent years. If you look at the average import content of export worldwide, used to be 20% 20 years ago. is around 40% today, and will probably be around 60% 20 years from now. Now, what this means, on top of other, if not discoveries, but relations of measuring trade in valuation, for instance, the fact that as compared to measuring trade in volumes where goods remain, if trade measured in value, the highest part of international trade, if you measure it in value addition, services become the main part of international trade, and we all know that value addition works a bit differently in services as it works in goods. But this transformation also means that objecting to opening trade and the old method, which was putting tariffs in order to protect your producer from foreign competition, makes less and less sense. In other words, this evolution of market capitalism through this multi-localization of production processes is progressively killing one of the versions of market capitalism, which was mercantilism. And for one simple reason, which is that the moment more than half of what you export you have to import, shooting on your imports is the best way to deteriorate the competitiveness of your exports. And this is a big change, and it's a welcome change in many ways, because of course it's good and important to have rules that prevent people from doing stupid things. That's a common feature of many societies, but the best thing is if you realize that if you do that, you're doing stupid things. And I think it's much more convincing and probably energetic shaping behavior if one realizes that doing one thing is not what you should do to maximize your interest, whether as a producer or as a consumer. So this change is on the way. It's taking place at a very high speed, which leads to a third major component, which I tried to describe through various angles in this book, which is that as the patterns of trade change, the way you open trade also changes. In other words, opening trade is removing, decreasing obstacles to trade, but with this big transformation, obstacles to trade are also different. The traditional obstacle to trade, the purpose of which was to protect your domestic producer from foreign competition, are fading away. Average trade-weighted tariff in the world of today is probably below 5%, as compared to 30–40%, which was the case after the Second World War. So, in many ways, intellectually, that sort of obstacle to trade is dying. It's like these stars, the light of which you still see, because it takes a bit of time. They're so far for their light to come to rise, but they've been dead for decades, and for some of them for centuries if they are very far away. What matters now are obstacles of a different nature, which are not measures, the purpose of which is to protect your producer, but measures, the purpose of which is to protect your consumer. Or, more precisely, it's not the measure itself that is an obstacle to trade, but it is the difference in the way different nations intend and regulate the protection of their consumers. Now, this has always been a big debate. I mean, it appeared a long time ago, and all the economists in this room will remember this way of looking at this shift through tariff measures and non-tariff measures. And the amount of economic, micro and macroeconomic calculation that were done at the time to compare the impact on trade of tariff measures as compared to non-tariff measures in translating non-tariff measures into tariff equivalents. What economists had in mind at the time was sort of tariff measures are decreasing, but non-tariff measures are erected to replace tariff measures, sort of substitution. Now, I think with the distance of time, this is not the right approach. Even if there remain gray zones, some domestic regulation to protect the consumer are not always devised totally independently of vested interests of producers, but most of these measures are now erected, most of these regulations take place for reasons which have to do with precaution. This switching in a way from protectionism to precaution. Some could say precautionism in some cases. Now, it's a totally different game. It's a totally different game because, again, the main purpose of the measure is not to protect from competition, but to protect from risks. And of course, that leads to a much more complex game because measuring a tariff on scrap metal or bicycles and how much of a reduction of your tariff on scrap metal should I give you on my tariff on bicycles for us to do a good deal is, let's say, ideologically neutral. Bicycles are roughly the same all over the planet. Scrap metal is roughly the same around the planet. When it's about precaution, the spectrum of differences, of collective preferences, as we could say, is much wider and much more difficult to shrink. Risk is a sort of scale of starting with bad, going to good, and this, of course, by definition, is not objective. So it has to do with the perception of which, and the perception of which is culturally much more connotated than in the case of tariffs. So reducing these differences in precaution, which are an obstacle to trade. If I'm a London producer of cut flowers and I have to export to the US, EU, Japan, zero tariff, I've been given duty-free tariff for a long time. If the maximum pesticide residue in the US is X micrograms, if in EU it is Y micrograms, and if in Japan it is W micrograms, I have a problem with my economies of scale. And this is the real obstacle to leveling the playing field in such a way that the efficiency gains from international exchange accrue. So, it's a different game. It's a game about regulatory convergence, basically. And to the difference of tariffs where the collective mentality has always been the best tariff is zero. And whatever way we reduce tariff in our mental horizon, we all have zero in mind. If it's about protecting health, for instance, through having maximum pesticide residues on cut flowers, the horizon is not zero. And any minister that would go to this parliament saying my country has a pro-development policy, which in many countries is good, not in all, but in many countries, and for the sake of showing that we really care about development, I will make a special higher maximum residue pesticide standard for Rwanda, which is a least developed country, but I'll have a different one for Israel or Costa Rica to also produce good flowers. That would never work. It's just politically totally impossible. So it's a different game. The political economy of this game is also different. When you're a trade minister, a trade negotiator, and you negotiate tariffs, you usually have consumers on your side and producers against you. And the problem is often that consumers are less vocal than producers for many, many reasons. Now, if the game is about regulatory convergence, the game changes. You basically have the producers on your side because they are appetized by economies of scale stemming from regulatory convergence. But you might well have consumers against you, consumers caring about the level of precaution which they got in their domestic system, and very often having the view that the others are doing less well in terms of precaution. So any idea that regulatory convergence will take place immediately induces the idea that the level of precaution will result in a lower standard because the level of playing field will be lower. I personally believe it's going to be the other way around. But you know, this is a matter of appreciation. But you can see the sort of difficult and nevertheless important transition from, for instance, tariff preferences to the notion of regulatory preferences, from the notion of dumping in the price of goods to the notion of dumping in the level of precaution. So all these debates, which will remain there, have to be taken in a different way. A different game, a different story, a different political approach, different fora, and the places in international system where regulatory convergence is taking place, and it's not everywhere, but it's already taking place in areas like animal health or within the ISO or within Codex Alimentarius for food. These places are not trade places. They are regulatory agencies who usually project a sort of convergence of what national regulatory agencies do. And by the way, these national regulatory agencies are not trade people either. But so far, this vision that the new name of the game is about regulatory convergence has been put in the hands of trade people. And this is, again, an adjustment that will need to take place. I've been, since I left WTO, a strong advocate of a thesis which I did not invent because it appeared in the report of the Speaker on World Trade, which was a report of a group of stakeholders I convened and which reported in April 2013, with this notion that although the World Trade Organization, which is the multilateral organization for trade, is not in charge of sectoral regulatory convergence, it's not the WTO that will negotiate prudential regulations on bank and insurance. This is done in Basel with the Financial Stability Board. It's not in WTO that we will negotiate a worldwide multilateral standard on the definition of foot and mouth disease or on my cut flower pesticide residues. But there needs to be something like the organization of this game so that multilateral convergence happens at the aid, which is why I have pleaded. Again, it's easier for me to do that now, and I think it's nothing terribly controversial, for this multilateral organization to be entrusted with some sort of monitoring, surveillance of this regulatory convergence. And by the way, this is an area where the sort of knowledge, experience, the sort of reach out of the OECD expertise in many of these areas could, in my view, also be put to use. Finally, on sort of how to process all this, which is part of the developments in this book I devote to global governance, which is an issue I've been working on for some years now. Anthony, in his short introduction, mentioned this Oxford Martin School report, which I will have an occasion to re-talk about here, the occasion of the forum. But I think the experience of 20 years in this business of trade inevitably leads to the question of whether the system, the institutions, the way decisions are prepared, processed, taken, when they are taken, or not taken, when they are not taken, works. And on this, I sort of mix what I wrote last summer with what we wrote in the Oxford Martin School report, which we issued during the autumn, which is this lesson from experience, and that's what we did with the Oxford Martin School, where we took roughly 10 global issues that worked for the last 3 decades, and 10 global issues that did not work. HIV/AIDS worked reasonably, overfishing the oceans failed miserably, financial regulation before 2008 was a big failure. Tobacco control is probably somewhere in between. So what we did was desiccating, analyzing why what worked and why what didn't work. And if you apply this to the field of trade, there are many reasons in the difficulties of moving forward the WTO multilateral regulatory agenda. But one of the lessons of experience in other areas is that what works best is to move these global challenges towards quicker solutions, which of course is a huge issue, whether you look at environment, health, trade, finance. I won't give you the whole list. Is a coalition-based model. In other words, where it really works is where the players are not only nation states, the sort of 200 Westphalians animals that populate the international system, but when other actors who have either an international reach or a local reach intervene, such as, for instance, business or civil society, whether it's multinationals and, let's say, multinational NGOs, and there are a number of them, or whether it's more locally based. Either public institutions, such as towns, megapoles, And you probably have on this planet 100 mayors who are more powerful than half of the members of the UN General Assembly. And same for civil society, and same for businesses. And I think this is a lesson which we have to have in mind for the future. If I, for instance, look at the reasons why Bali worked, and I took the risk in writing this book during June and July. I took the risk, and you will see that in the preface of the book, which was written at the time to predict that Bali would work, and I really thought it would work. And one of the reasons why I thought it would work is precisely because it's one of the topics in international trade negotiations where, for the first time since a long time, what traders, what business, what people who every day have to pay, what crossing borders means in terms of their P&L, and the agenda of trade negotiators was aligned. There was a pro-trade facilitation lobby, and by the way, the OECD at the time helped a lot in crafting a narrative that was across the board. It was the interest of opening trade and reducing the costs that still have to do not with tariffs but with the administrative cost of crossing borders. It was the interest of people because the simpler the customs system is, the best it is in terms of the proceeds where tariff remain, and this is the case in many developing countries. And it was also a sort of mantra that was adopted, including by the sort of operators in aid for trade, who now have a real focus, which I think will be a big leverage for the future. So those are a few of the issues I'm writing about in this piece. It's again, I try to continue it for a wider public than usual trade negotiators, although I also think that their culture need to adjust to changes which, in my view, have not yet fully been considered by a number of them. This is not lecturing them. They all have to do what trade negotiators do, which is right or wrong my country, and this is perfectly understandable, but I think the size of these changes probably leads to some strategic rethinking in some of these issues. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that tour d'horizon of what is a very dense work in many respects, and you've taken us through a number of issues which I think certainly the cognoscenti here appreciate. I'm perhaps, if I may, to allow the audience to warm up with their questions, and I'm sure there will be many. I wanted to pick up, in a sense, on some of the comments you made right at the beginning and some of the comments you made right at the end. You just said, my country, right or wrong. Very interesting, because towards the end of your book, you talk about Mars and Venus, not men and women. You talk about, in a sense, the what I might term the perfect. And I always remember that expression, le parfait est l'ennemi du bien. Are we in a world where the WTO Secretariat and Director General, the OECD Secretariat, are in a perfect space, looking for that perfect space? And human beings, we are eminently imperfect. The science of economics is going through all sorts of contortions now through this crisis, recognizing and realizing that it is a lot closer to political science than it is to physics, and the imperfections that that brings. And I'm wondering, in a sense, how one reconciles what at some levels can be deemed to be absolutely justified and theoretically opportune, in a sense with what with what is feasible in a far less perfect way, when you're actually having to marry the fact that very often one is confronting good politics being the opposite of good policy. So I don't want to take you on the terrain that would compromise the délai de veuvage, which would be very delicate. But at the same time, I think it would be very interesting to hear a little bit more from you regarding that reconciliation of the issues that you have addressed here with what you said, what matters to people: jobs, health, food, the environment, corruption, their overall well-being. Who's representing them in the WTO? You said my country, right or wrong. Whose country? And who's getting the marching orders from a certain position, for example, in a field like trade facilitation, where, as you said, we were very active recently. And I mean, in all respects, one would say that this is good for people, this is good for citizens. And so who are the mediators? Who are they getting in the way? Are they facilitating? And last, very provocative, do you think there's a danger that the sunset clause that you proposed as part of the Oxford Commission could actually be used against the entities that are trying to develop these very high standards and this perfection, and that they might be used by those who feel that it's very awkward and it's actually putting people in a very uncomfortable position in certain quarters relative to the achievement of what could be considered to be the greatest good for the greatest number? Sorry, that's a very long question.
No, I mean, on the first one, I've had very often this impression, for instance, around the UN Chief Executive Board meetings, which are meetings that take place during 2 days, twice a year, under the chair of the UNSG, and when you have heads of multilateral international organizations more or less related to the UN, whether it's the family, whether it's the funded program, whether it's the political institutions, that these people are sitting around the table, which is in Venus, where you care about common good, public goods, the global interest of humanity, sort of UN spirit. And then when you're back to your General Council, or to the board of the World Bank, or the board of the IMF, or what is the board of the UNDP, or UNEP, you're not in Venus anymore, you're on Mars. With people who fight for the interests of their country as they see it. They will make speeches about public good, common good, but the reality will be that they know that their career will depend on domestic politics. And it's all back to this question that political legitimacy today lies in communities which are very distant from whatever dream or idea you have of a world community. How many citizens of this planet would say, first, I'm a citizen of the world? So they are first and foremost citizens of local communities, which is where the pot of legitimacy brews. And this contradiction is there. It is inbuilt in the way the international system works with 200 sovereign nation states who care about their sovereignty a lot, not least because sort of theory of the system is that sovereigns are equals. So it's inbuilt. I think you have to live with that, recognizing again that the real source of political legitimacy is where people feel they belong to. And they belong to a municipality, they belong to a region, they belong to a nation. Look at Europe, who has yet not addressed properly this problem of a continuum between local, regional, national, and European identity, sense of belonging, a fortiori for the size of the planet. And I've changed my mind on this. When I wrote at the end of my term as commissioner a book which was called World Democracy,